All right, with all these tariffs and all this political nonsense, I thought we'd look at a bit more of a fun one here, you know. Who doesn't like looking at anything from Japan? So, how Tokyo proves the housing crisis is a scam by Get Based. I like the username. Let's see. Why are we paying so much in rent? And is it a scam?
Tokyo is the biggest city on Earth, and you would think that came with high housing costs, terrible little tiny apartments, and overall a housing crisis. But you'd be wrong. See, Tokyo actually has some of the most affordable housing on the planet. All while cities like London, New York, even Vancouver spiral out of control. What's their secret? And why aren't we in North America copying it? Let's dive into it.
Japanese people are better in every way. That's the idea, right?
Housing crisis, a term that today defines life in almost any major city. From America to Europe and Asia, owning or even renting a property is becoming unaffordable even for the middle class, and no one seems to be able to do anything about it. But that's not the case here, in the world's largest urban area, housing almost 40 million people.
Holy smokes. Just for context, guys.
40 million.
40 million people is as much as the country of Canada. There is as many people in one city in Japan as the entire country of Canada. I'm actually really blown away to see how they've maintained their housing prices.
You know, it's just based on millions of people in concentrated areas. This blew my mind as well. When I went to New Zealand, when I lived there for 3 years, there's like, I don't know, around 5 million people there. That's in Arizona, in Phoenix, there's 5 million people here, approximately. It's just, New Zealand is empty compared. Even Australia, take a guess right now. How many people do you think are in Australia? You're likely going to be wrong because it's like 24 million or something. What is it? Population of Australia. 26.64 million. I would have thought that place had, I thought it was like more than 100 million, maybe even 200 million. No, that's it. That's all they got. God damn, now I gotta find my video. Holy crap, that's the worst part. Thank you, sir.
First, let's establish how cheap Tokyo actually is, because it's not a minor difference. According to Loughborough University Global City Ranking, these are the 9 most economically important cities in the world, and compared to every single one of them, Tokyo is by far the most affordable, both in terms of property prices and cost of rent.
It is so sad to me that Canada is nowhere on this list, nowhere to be found on this list. Actually, a few weeks ago, the U.S. government, President Trump, was kind of going through and talking about making Canada the 51st state.
Canada.
I'm sure you've seen the memes. And it came to light that Canada, as a country, if it did become a state of the USA, it would be the 9th most productive state. We as Canadians, if you're a Canadian, you're watching this, you should be offended. Only the 9th most productive on a GDP level state.
That's pretty
crazy. We have oil, fresh water, we have transportation, ports, and forestry. Why would we only be the 9th largest state in the USA? And
I don't know that I care that a country is the number 1 in GDP. I mean, sure, you're talking about production value, right? But why is every country or individual trying to look at the country's top status just on GDP? Like, how good is a country based on its GDP? What about just the average life of the human being there? Maybe it doesn't produce as much as many other countries, but is the average person there able to live a life where they can thrive with a simple or relatively simple job? Wouldn't that be a better measurement?
And why aren't we captured in the 9 most economic? There's no Canadian cities on here.
I still get his point.
As the 9 most economically important cities in the world. Makes you think. Makes you wonder.
Tokyo is much cheaper than London or New York, but it's also cheaper than Shanghai and Beijing.
Crazy.
Holy crap.
Crazy.
160% more expensive than Tokyo. 290% rent prices New York.
New York is a joke. You should watch Cash Jordan on this topic. New
in
York is a
Tokyo.
joke.
That
man.
is actually way, way more than I thought it was going to be.
Even though average wages in both of the Chinese cities are much lower than in Tokyo, and it's cheaper than Singapore, even though Singapore has been praised for its affordable housing. In other words, compared to any other global city, Tokyo is dirt cheap. And while you might be thinking that this would be explained by Japan's population crisis, that's not actually true. While the Japanese population has slightly decreased in the past 20 years, the size of Tokyo City, which makes up about 1/3 of the entire urban area, has been going up. And in the last 2 decades, it added just as many people as London or New York. The way Tokyo
Well, as far as I understand, a lot of people from smaller villages in Japan are going to Tokyo for work. If anyone's in Japan watching this, is that correct? A lot of smaller villages are kind of, I guess, dying in some sense. It's the same in Italy. It's sad because some of these villages are really special in their own way, I'm sure. Some villages, towns, whatever you want to call them. And probably the reason why the metropolis is growing. So,
Tokyo
or one of
remains
the reasons.
affordable is by simply building a lot more housing than other cities, which might not seem that revolutionary. After all, it's what politicians in basically every Western country have been promising to do for decades. But the thing is that despite these promises, most major cities are completely failing in actually doing that. And unlike them, Tokyo has been able to actually do what everyone else is just talking about, thanks to the unique way of how Japanese cities are designed. So,
I just realized, am I reacting to a guy reacting to a video?
how do they do it? Well, there are 3 things that make Japanese urban planning different from almost anywhere else on the planet. First, Japan holds a first place in 2 specific categories. It has the highest inheritance tax in the world, and it has more earthquakes than any other country.
Yo, inheritance tax is annoying. Get rid of that, man.
This young man is not about to tell me that they tax their way to prosperity, is he? I'm going to rip through this screen and choke a man out if he goes and tells me that our problems are solved through inheritance tax.
And as a result, it has a unique approach to urban planning and architecture. Because houses in Japan have a higher risk of being damaged by earthquakes, and because in order to pass down a house to your kids, they would have to pay a 50% of its value in inheritance tax,
crazy.
real estate in Japan is seen very differently than anywhere else. Rather than being an asset that will always appreciate in value over time, and that you build to last as long as possible, in Japan, real estate is more like consumer goods. Just like you wouldn't expect a fridge to last forever, houses in Japan are not built to last, and people don't want to live in pre-owned buildings. And so most houses
Interesting.
have a pretty short lifespan of about 30 years, after which they are usually demolished, and something else is built in their place. In Tokyo, only 1% of houses are older than 1951, and the housing market is in a constant process of tearing down old buildings and building new ones, which means that the housing market is much more flexible and adapts much better to the current demand. Every neighborhood is constantly changing, and if there is a now bigger demand for housing than there used to be, you can just easily tear down a few one-story houses and build something a lot bigger instead, and then maybe downsize once again if the demand goes down. But this wouldn't be really possible anywhere else, which takes us to the second factor, regulation, or actually the lack of it.
I knew regulation was going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I think what it comes down to, and we're going to finish the video obviously, but I think ultimately what it comes down to is that we aren't dumping our life savings into a house expecting it to pay us back and kind of act as a retirement plan. Therefore, we can be more picky and choosy as to how much things cost, and it costs less to build because it costs less time going through all this governmental red tape.
Complying
I think also in the US, as far as I remember, the statistic is that most people, they move every 7 years, or they buy a place and they move from it every 7 years, which is crazy. I think this is Copenhagen, man. That image right there, that's Copenhagen. Yeah. I've done real estate photography in this white building right here on the right, if this is Copenhagen, if I remember correctly. Anyways, bureaucracy is, for me, bureaucracy is obviously super annoying. But when I don't even own a home, but if I do end up owning a home, I would have loved to assume that this could be like a home in which my kids can grow in as well. Is it just me? Or do we just want to move from home to home like it is a consumer good, like another car or something? I don't know, man. I've always had this idea that having a home, you can build memories in it, and I don't know. What do you think? You keep it in your family in some way, right? But I guess that's not the case in many places.
With all of them means that building anything is really expensive, and it's almost impossible to build any kind of dense housing, meaning that free space is used in a very inefficient way. On top of that, zoning regulations usually restrict what kind of housing can be built in one area, and often only allow one specific type. For example, single-family homes, which leads to the existence of massive suburbs with no services.
Yo, this sucks. The US is terrible for this. And on one side, you kind of have your own space, it's all good, like extreme individualism. And on the other hand, it's just not, I don't think humanity is supposed to live like this. I don't mean we're supposed to live in dense urban environments either. But this is cancer, man.
But in Tokyo, you don't really have any of those restrictions. Japanese zoning laws encourage mixed-use zones, meaning that you can have different kinds of housing in one neighborhood, and buildings of different shapes, heights, and sizes right next to each other, something that would be never allowed in most places across America or Europe.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how important zoning is. It's another case of where government makes rules, or institutions make rules on behalf of the government, most likely, that just isn't serving the average people. I really, and I repeat this in almost every video, I think government should be small and let the people adapt to the conditions, because when people are able to adapt to the conditions, it's faster than government.
There's basically no regulation for how dense these neighborhoods should be, how much parking they need, or what these buildings should look like. Which is why in Tokyo, you have so many houses that look like this. And as a result, Japanese zoning is able to use space a lot more efficiently, and build a lot of housing in relatively small areas.
It becomes a game of Tetris. You've got more efficient housing with a lot less planning, which looks a lot dumber, but is a lot more useful. So what do we care about? Do we want things that look nice but are too expensive for the majority of people to own, or that look dumb but are used incredibly efficiently?
I have to disagree a bit here. Well, I don't know what his take is, but I'm telling you, man. You ever
or that look dumb
let's
but are
find it.
used.
This one. If you know anything about this style of housing, this one's all right, but you'll see areas where it just really is an eyesore. And there's also something we don't consider enough, is the beautification of a city is more important than you could ever put a financial value on. Do you know why so many people go to Paris or so many people go to Italy? Obviously there's a history and food and culture and all that, but the architecture of the places are so important. It doesn't mean Italy and Paris don't have ugly places, but they're not usually in the center city. And it's really difficult to put a financial price on that beauty. But it's safe to say it's incredibly important to try to build a city that looks visually good to the eye. And I don't mean a plastic facade. I mean real buildings with real, with public use, or basically the ability to look at something and think, hey, I live in a city which is made of art in some way, or some of it is made artfully with craftsmanship and done not just to house people in the cheapest way possible, which is, man, I remember watching a video on how much money that brings into a city, just the beautification of it. It was large. It was a large amount of money.
Incredibly efficient.
It was a
Something
theory,
tells
right?
me too, if it was more
not a theory, sorry. It was like an assumption, I guess.
more efficiently used, it would be better for the earth, better for our resources. Oh man, this is starting to sound pretty good.
And finally, unlike in much of the developed world, Tokyo and the majority of cities in Japan don't really have NIMBYs, people who actively oppose any development in their local area and push for the strictest possible housing regulations. And it's not just because of the different mentality. The real reason why Japan doesn't have this phenomenon is because NIMBYism is, well, not allowed. Or to be precise, in most of the world, it's the local governments that decide what gets built and where. Because the job of these local governments is to protect the interests of local residents, they are often motivated to block any new development in their area that the locals are usually not happy about. But
Yeah,
because
sure.
that happens in every neighborhood, the end result is that you can't actually build anything anywhere. But in Japan, this is decided on a centralized national level, and regional governments and local citizens don't really get any say in that matter. In that way, the decisions are made by people who are supposed to have the bigger picture in mind.
Yeah, but I think in general, the Japanese in general have more of a community mindset in the sense that you're not living for your own individualism entirely. And I think in the US, NIMBY is a thing because of that. And regarding the housing thing with like the what you'd call incorrectly the Eastern blocks or the single family housing, they're both terrible examples.
This typical urban planning process looks a lot more decentralized. However, the urban planning in Japan looks a lot more centralized. Typically, I would go ahead and say that decentralization is the best. Obviously, the
Sure.
decentralization of the urban planning isn't the only reason that things are more expensive here in North America or in Western culture. You've also got this incredible.
Well, it's not really decentralized if the people of a community can decide that nothing else should be built there. That means it's a centralized effort. Is it not? I mean, either way, the decentralized would mean that anyone could come in and do anything they want, as long as it's not in someone's private yard or private space. But they could build next to them if it's available. That would be decentralized.
Centralized planning around the money and the monetary system, and people are forced to use their houses like savings account. So it's interesting to see our ethos here of centralization and decentralization playing out. Decentralize all the things, you get less efficient, more expensive, but ultimately safer. You are not hindered by one group of people's decisions, or centralize them. You get them more efficient and cheaper, but at the same time, the danger here is that this group of urban planners in Japan could just change their mind and dictate new rules. This is the risk of centralization.
And as a result, they are a lot more development friendly and more housing gets built. And in that way, Japan effectively bypasses.
The thing about centralization is that you have to just innately hope that the centralized institution has your best efforts, your best interests in mind, or simply does a good job. Like, you don't know. That's the thing. You don't have the control,
The
which
NIMBY
is good and
problem.
bad, right?
Now, of course, there are downsides. With higher density, you don't get a lot of green spaces, and Tokyo
Yeah.
has much less of them than most big cities.
Yeah,
People
it's
have to
bad.
put up with constant development, and they can't really influence what gets built in their neighborhood. But the bottom line is that by building so much, Tokyo is one of the few major cities in the world that manages to remain affordable for everyone. And it demonstrates that housing crises are not inevitable, and that we can solve them by just building more. But then, why aren't cities all over the world taking an example from Tokyo? Well, some of the things are probably not possible to reapply anywhere else. It's unlikely that Europe would start demolishing all
Well,
the historic buildings and
course.
replacing them with new development.
It's also why should every? It's funny we pause at the same time, so it's weird. it's what? Why should one strategy be applied to every other country? It won't work in every other country. It's the same like the U.S. style constitution isn't really serving the Philippines very well, even though they harbor the same type of thing. You need specific. This is the thing, man. Every place needs context and rules and methods applied to that context.
Imagine these buildings that are 500 years old being demolished to put
Oh
up
my
some
God.
concrete one-story box. Yeah, definitely not viable
No.
in lots of countries.
I agree.
In Japan, your house is a temporary product that's probably not going to be worth much in 30 years' time. But in most of the world, your home is your most valuable
Yeah.
asset. The difference between being lower or middle class, your retirement policy, and the sign that
You want to know how these houses are built? It's practically wooden beams, cardboard, and chicken wire. I'm telling you, they suck.
That you made it, that we have all been sold. That's why people who already have a property fight so hard against anything that could decrease its value, like more housing in their area, even though it's making it so much more unattainable for everyone else. And if and how that could ever change, well, who knows?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I love that closing argument, that closing statement around when we use housing like a retirement plan, it goes up in value because people are less willing to do things that make it easier for other people to enter the market. It's back to this supply and demand economics.
Yeah, the thing is, if something were to only be 30 years in length, or it's basically you get it and eventually you leave it not long after, that makes sense if the cost of that object is lower than the average, or something that's easily attainable for the average person. If it's too high, it won't make sense, right?
Money and housing is no different. It's like you almost got it. But it's not that Japan builds more housing. It's that there's no incentive for rich people to buy up many properties and hoard them like a dragon, which is the problem in the US at least. I think that there is very, very little incentive, especially if the culture in Tokyo, in Japan, is to keep real estate as a wear item, as a consumable, but we are doing that with housing. And as a result, our housing is getting worse because people are looking at it like an investment. And of course, you want to maintain your investment, but you don't want to keep it pristine, your investment. You're not necessarily upgrading things below the surface that need to be upgraded that actually improve the quality of a property.
That's correct. And I see this because I'm a real estate photographer. I see, I say this all the time, but a lot of the workmanship in some of these places, and it's for more factors than just it being an investment property, perhaps, or the idea of it. It's really bad. You will end up going into that home, and it's likely that you will face many issues within the years you're there. Many. It could be anything from water damage to... It's literally, I've been in multi-million-dollar homes where the door doesn't even close properly, or the handle is a bit shaky. Like this is crazy to me. I was walking on stairs, and you know you have stairs like this usually, and here it was. I hope you can see this, where it was peeking over. This part, when I stepped on it, just fell off. There's so many examples I have. It's small things and sometimes big things, and it's
lipstick on a pig.
You just don't want to buy a house in the U.S.
and move it. The first step Japan took in solving the housing crisis is identifying the fact that there is no crisis and there is an unbelievable amount of extra space all over the world to fit about 40 times the population. Woo! This man understands that we do not have a population crisis. The world is underpopulated and we have a lot more room.
Yeah.
I think that if a society values green space, there will be green space for the society to use. Imagine being a builder, being a central planner around neighborhoods, and hearing from the population, we want more green space. And if they're
let me tell you something. These two buildings right here, that's a ghetto building.
On neighborhoods, and hearing from the population, we want more green space. And if there was that space, not giving it to them. Free market, it doesn't work that way. The free market naturally gravitates towards giving the mass what they need and what they want. Last comment, we have 55% inheritance tax is brutal. You better trust your centralized government to take care of you. Yeah, that's the alternative view. That's the secondary layer. I'm wondering if in taxing property, obviously it screws over all the people that own property today. And obviously Canadian, American, UK governments, they all have the ability to do this. And so I'm of two minds here. I mean, let me know in the comments down below, which is better? Is it having these central planners that make things a little bit better, not looking at housing as this savings tool? I think that's a net positive, but I'm not sure if I like the central planning. I'm not sure how much centralization I like creeping into my life.
Yeah, and look, I had no idea I was reacting to a reaction video, but go follow him and go comment on his video if you'd like. I'll also link the original video he might have watched. I'll link it too. I should have watched it directly, my bad. But hey, I think we should read some comments. Because after 40 years of housing bubble, Japanese realize housing is just a place to live, not to get rich from. So you know what? Let's see what the comments are on this original video. Boom. A key factor often overlooked is that 25% of new homes are being acquired by investors rather than individuals seeking primary residences. And that's a lot. Even if baby boomers decide to offload their properties or more housing stocks enter the market, it won't alleviate the underlying issue. Wealthy investors will continue to absorb the available inventory, which will keep home prices elevated. You've seen those like auction housing things in Australia where the bank literally comes and will practically overbid you in every case. It's bad, man. I'm a Japanese national. These are the people we want to hear from. I'm a Japanese national who has lived in the UK for 2 decades and recently moved back to Japan because of the housing issue. Yeah, well, the UK is another beast in itself. The UK has gotten too expensive, and I could not see myself investing so much time, energy, and money at a time when UK seems like it's in a downward spiral. Exactly. I've been back in Japan for 2 years, and already my quality of life is much better. My quality of life. My salary when converted to British pounds is not as high as it was in England, but that's it. Here in Japan, I live in a condominium 3-minute walk from a major underground metro loop line in the large city. My place here is bigger, cleaner, and more convenient, and importantly cheaper than it was back in England when I'm paying for 2 car park spaces. It really boggles my mind. It all comes down to money. If you want big salaries, Japan is not the place to be. What Japan gives you is stability and peace of mind, and that is something that has been severely lacking in many countries around the world. See, I like this ending here. This is my point somewhere in the video when I said it, is why are we measuring everything by GDP? As if that is what determines how good your country is. You want a place where you can live a life without the constant stresses of finance in your way. And I'm sure Japan has its own issues. They have a large infertility problem. They have major other issues. But you do want to find a place, in some sense, where life can just be a bit slower. Now, what he's saying here might not apply to Tokyo. I wouldn't know. I would love to have heard from him about this, because I know there's a lot of issues about things like salarymen, where it's nothing but work. And if there's an infertility crisis, that's another problem. But if we ignore those just for a second, the idea is that you just want some peace of mind. You can work a job, you can get ahead, you can get a place, you can have kids, your wife, and still pay for life, right? Isn't that like, does that sound so crazy these days? In the West, at least? It's like this is unattainable now. That's what it feels like. And it's not true for everyone, but it's unattainable for a lot of people. And that, again, that's not sustainable. We need to get back to a point where you can work a single job, sounds even more crazy, and be able to support a family, even in the basics, with a vacation, whatever. You guys are thinking like, man, that's asking too much, right? I understand. What do you think? I'm going to link this video as well. Please watch it. Please give it a likety-like, and let me know what you think. Why is Tokyo doing better than the other major cities?